how I began the medical missionary work was I didn't want to treat my children with drugs. My first daughter got an earache, and as a nurse, I'd been trained as a nurse. I took her straight to the doctor because that's what I've always been taught. And he gave her a course of antibiotics. She was 16 months. Well, over the next 6 weeks, 4 courses of antibiotics later, the earache comes back. I'm so frustrated because I didn't want to keep giving my daughter antibiotics, but I didn't know what else to do. Because we're brought up that when you're sick, you just go to the doctor. You just go to emergency. And people would pressure me and say, you don't want to play with ears, she'll go deaf. So I didn't want my daughter to go deaf. So when my next child got an earache, I didn't go to the doctor. I didn't tell my family. I went to the old lady next door. I'm 25, she's 85. I said, what did your mother do when you had an earache? She said, Mum would steam up an onion on the stove. I ran home, steamed the onion on the stove, wrapped it in a cloth, put it on my son's ear. He was 18 months and he was breastfeeding at the time, and so I could put the onion against my arm and feel the temperature, and he fell asleep and he slept for 2 hours. What does that tell you? He's got relief. When he woke up, he was happy. James is 45 today. I don't think he's had another earache. But can you imagine my excitement? 6 weeks, 4 courses of antibiotics, and an onion poultice on the ear for 2 hours. I was excited. At this stage, I was not a Christian. I was a bit of a hippie, back to nature lifestyle, and we probably smoked too much marijuana. And we did all natural things. And then I had a neighbour who had a young couple staying with them, and they'd just become Seventh-day Adventists. So we became friendly. They were the same age as me. She started to share books with me. In fact, the first book I read was Counsels on Diet and Food. And I thought, this makes sense. So I started to do it. And then I read more, and I read more. And then eventually I surrendered my life to God. I thought, this makes so much sense. Now I wanted to know, what does God think about the body and about what happens when we get sick? Is it God's plan that we give the body drugs? And then I read more and more how God made the body to heal itself. And I read verses like, present your bodies living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God. And growing up in the Presbyterian Church, I did not know that these messages were in the Bible, and the story of Daniel, who purposed in his heart that he's not going to defile his body with the king's food and wine. And at the end of 3 years he was tested, and Daniel and his 3 friends were 10 times smarter than the wise men in the realm. So stories like this I started to see from the Bible, and I started to realise God gave us a body with an inbuilt ability to heal, and what he requires of us is to look after our bodies. And that's when I started to realise that so many people don't know that. And so as my children grew, then there was an epidemic of whooping cough. All these children got whooping cough. The vaccinated got whooping cough. Did you hear that? All the people that were all the children were vaccinated, and the children weren't vaccinated. Some of them got it, some of them didn't. It's a 100-day cough. And then I read in my herb book that plantain, I see it growing around here, it's also called ribwort, that it's very good for the chest. So I started to heat it up in the pot. As soon as it came to the boil, turn it off, then I put a bit of lemon and honey in it, strain it when it got cool, and I gave it to my children. I got them to do tea parties, got them interesting straws. And my eldest daughter was still wetting the bed at that time. She was about 5. She stopped wetting the bed. And then I went back to the book and it said that it's also a kidney herb. So this is how God taught me, little by little, through my experiences. And it was really when the children got sick and I began to explore in different books, what can you do for this? All my friends' children were still coughing and my children were over it. And they said, what did you do? And when I told them, they were very sad because their children don't like herb teas. Their children only like to drink juice and cordials and soda pops. And that's when I realised that if a parent has no control over their child, they can't actually do anything to them when they're sick. And that's why when I did a parenting series, the first thing I talked about was the relationship between the mother and father and presenting a united front. And my next session was on guidelines, because no one likes the word discipline anymore. It's guidelines. So cause and effect with children. And then you can serve the food that you want them to eat, and then they will agree to be wrapped up in poultices. And the more I studied the Bible, the more I realised God wants us to present our bodies as living sacrifices. That means we have to look after our bodies. So this is Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Verse 2 says, be not conformed to this world. So what does this world usually do? Well, eats pretty badly. But what does this world also do? Is this world also, when they get sick, they give it over to the doctor. But I believe it's time for us to take responsibility and look after our own bodies. And I just can thank God that none of my children had an antibiotic after that. Do you know what antibiotic means? Against life. Now, I believe that an antibiotic could be used in a life-saving situation, but not for all these little bits and pieces that happen to our children, which is like a sore throat, a cold, a fever, step on a rusty nail. Well, we've helped many stepping on rusty nails. It's just a grated potato poultice. That's it. Keeps the wound open, lets it drain, it heals it from the inside out. But most people, again, go to hospital because of fear. And then I read in Isaiah 58, it talks about God speaking in Isaiah 58, I think it's about verse 6, it says, God says, is not this the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke. Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, bring the poor that are cast out to thy house, when thou seest the naked that thou cover him, and don't turn your face from your own flesh? Then shall your light break forth as the morning, your health shall spring forth speedily. Your righteousness shall go before thee, and the glory of the Lord will be thy reward. And I think that that's another beautiful illustration of the health retreat, because we see many people freed from addictions, freed from the slavery and bondage of coffee drinking, of even sugar addiction. And it's very hard for these people to do it by themselves. But when you start to bring relief to them with the simple natural remedies, in fact, it might sound terrible for me to say this, but I really love it when people get caffeine headaches, because it allows us to come in and not stand there and say, see, I told you coffee's bad. No. There's actually no need to say that. We come in with a hot foot bath. We put their feet in hot water, because when the feet go in hot water, it pulls the congestion from the head, which happens in a headache, down to the feet. And then we put a cool cloth on their head. And my daughter Jessica, all our children were our staff when we started the health retreat. And I taught my children from a young age what a wonderful thing it is to serve. So our children went into trades early. My daughter Jessica, she went into her massage course at 15. At 15, my next daughter Julia, she was our cook in our health retreat. But my daughter Jessica was tending a lady one day who had a very bad headache, and she had her feet in hot water and cool on her head, and she was massaging her. And the lady began to cry, and Jess said, "What's the matter?" She said, "No one has ever touched me the way you are touching me." She said, "I was put into a boarding school at 7. She said, my husband isn't very affectionate." She said, "No one has ever touched me the way you're touching me." What an incredible work this is. To touch the people and to show them that we have a loving Saviour, and it is because of him that we do this work. But I was intrigued with drug medication. Because I was trained as a nurse, I also didn't see it work. And I'm so happy to hear Dr. Neil Nedley's coming here, because it was his work that was the first work that gave me answers on mental health, because I didn't see it work in the hospital. And so when I went to a seminar by him, and I heard him say that he noticed as a GP, that a lot of his patients were on antidepressants. So he decided to implement lifestyle changes to see if that would help. He said that if he could even equal what drug medication did to manage the situation, he would be happy. He said it far exceeded. So changing lifestyle in the Sustain Me principles, getting them to go to bed early, implement an exercise program, start drinking more water, start easing off the stimulants, go on a plant-based diet. Did you hear what he said? Far exceeded what the medication did. I was on the edge of my seat. This was probably about 20 years ago when I attended his lecture in Sydney, Australia. And I got his book. It was called Depression, A Way Out. He's got another book, Proof Positive. And I started to share this with our guests who are on antidepressants. And we have seen, little by little, people coming off their antidepressants. Isn't that great news? Such simple things, and I believe that's what God meant it to be. If someone's on antidepressants, they can't just stop. If someone's on medication, they can't just stop, unless, of course, it's aspirin or statin drugs. But mind-altering drugs, and especially the cortisones, they cannot be stopped immediately, or the person will fall in a lump, because a lot of these medications are addictive. And what we have found, especially with pain-killing medication, eventually it's not doing what it first did, and now the person's addicted. And that's where these wellness retreats have an answer. Because at our health retreat we have steam saunas, we have juicing days, which I'm sure they do here. And what that does is that causes the body to go into a detox, and especially in the sweating, a lot of waste is sweated out. Do you know what some of that waste is? The drugs that they're addicted to. And I had a German lady in front of me at the end of the week one day. It was the end of the week, and she banged her fist on my desk, and I thought, whoa, what's coming? She said, "Why didn't I suffer?" Oh. In her German way. I said, well, I think it's the herbs, it's the juices, it's the steams. It all just causes those addictive substances to be released out of the body. And of course, when they're released out much quicker, your withdrawals greatly relieved. She said, well done. Some people come with patches to put on their skin. They're coming off cigarettes. You know what I say to them? Oh, you won't need them. They say, how can you say that? And I said, because we've seen many times that the more you hold on to, even if it's a nicotine patch, the harder it is to come off. You're better to just go stop. And one girl, she said to me, I know I can't smoke, but I've just got to hold on to the packet of cigarettes. Well, we can't force them. And she was walking around the next day so worried with her packet of cigarettes, and I went up to her and I said, I've got some advice that's going to make it so much easier for you. She said, what's that? I said, just give me the cigarettes. And you know, and she did, sometimes it's just putting that thought in their brain. And it's like another guy, this is what I always say to them when they're coming off cigarettes. I said, when did you have your last cigarette? This morning. Have you got any with you? Yes. I said, well, would you like to give them to me? No. I said, okay, well, we've got rules here and you can't smoke on the property. And, you know, they've got to go a long way off the property to smoke. And I saw one lady one day, she's at the front gate, it's pouring rain, and she's trying to light a cigarette. So they can't do it very much, but we've seen many people break that habit, and that habit is a very damaging one, and it's not easy to come off. But all of these experiences, a lot of our guests, especially the ones that don't believe in God, they don't realise that our aim is to show them Jesus. And often we see that. Often. On Friday night, we have chapel service. And we invite all our guests. We have chapel service. You're invited to chapel. Now remember, Australia's a very ungodly nation. I think I mentioned to you, we've had someone leave because we prayed with the first meal. And 99% of people come to chapel service. And they can choose a song. We usually sing about 4 or 5 hymns. And then my husband says a prayer and he reads a story out of the Bible, usually a story from the life of Jesus. And then our staff might do a couple of items. It goes for half an hour. And we've had people crying there. We've had people say, I've never been in church in my life. We've had people say, I'm going to look for a Seventh-day Adventist church. Every guest that comes gets a copy of the Ministry of Healing. We say this is our textbook. This is where we learnt these basic health principles. But I wanted to know what the Bible said about drugs. Did you know that the Bible does talk about drugs? Did you know that in Revelation, 4 times the word sorcery comes from the word pharmakeia? What's pharmakeia? You have pharmacies here? What do pharmacies sell? Drugs. So let me just show you 2 of them. And it's Revelation chapter 18 where it talks about Babylon is fallen. And we go to verse 23 to the last part. It says, and her merchants were the great men of the earth. What's a merchant? Salesman. Who are the greatest men of the earth? The wealthiest. What's the wealthiest company in the world? Pharmaceutical. Did you know they made billions out of the COVID vaccine? Her merchants were the great men of the earth, and by her sorceries were all nations deceived. Isn't that interesting? This is in Revelation. This is talking about the last days in Earth's history. In other words, drug medication is going to play a role. So let's look at that verse again. And by her sorceries were all nations deceived. It's the only time in the Bible where sorceries comes from the word pharmakeia. So in the Old Testament, sorceries is witchcraft. But in the New Testament, in Revelation 4 times. You can check that out. It's almost as if God put a veil over it, but in these last 20 years, this has started to be revealed. And I was listening to a theologian, and he investigated it, and he looked at when they were translating it, because he was intrigued. He said, do you know, when they came to the word pharmakeia, the first suggestion was poison, the second was drug, and the third was sorcery, and they chose sorcery. So if they'd used the first one, it would have been, and her merchants were the great men of the earth, and by her poisons were all nations received. Or if they'd used the second one, her merchants were the great men of the earth, and by her drugs were all nations deceived. So let's now go to Revelation 22 at verse 14. Blessed are they that keep his commandments, for they might have right to the tree of life. Amen. And enter into the gates of the city. Isn't that where we want to be? For without are dogs, sorcerers, murderers, whoremongers, those who loveth and keepeth a lie. So who's outside the city? The drug pushers from the pharmakeia. And then we read in Ellen White where she says drugs never cure disease. They just change the form and location. The body, and the body alone is the effective healer. And if left to herself, how much better could she perform her work? But that privilege is rarely granted it. So let's get back to the blessed are they that have right to the tree of life, that they might enter into the gates of the city and have right to the tree of life. For without are dogs, sorcerers. What are the dogs? That's number one. And the second is number two. That's before the murderers and the whoremongers and the adulterers. So what are the dogs? In Isaiah 56 verse 10. The Bible says that his watchmen are blind. They are all dumb dogs that cannot bark, lying down, sleeping, loving to slumber. The watchmen. Who are the watchmen? And in the next verse it talks about the shepherds. These are the ones that should be blowing the trumpet saying, this is a poison. Don't put this into your body. Don't defile your body with this poison. And yet what are they? They're dumb dogs that cannot bark. The watchmen are dumb dogs. So what's worse in the sight of God than even the drug pushers and the murderers and the whoremongers? What's worse? The watchmen that won't bark. Leaving you with that point to mull over in your mind and maybe explore when you go home. And let's look on the other hand of Psalm 104 verse 14, that God gave the herbs for the service of man.